Good morning, dear ones, and welcome to the Unity of Claremont Sunday lesson for June the 21st, 2020. I'm only going to make one announcement, which is that we are continuing to have our Wednesday night Crystal Singing Bowl meditation outdoors. If it rains, we will come in, and if we come in, we will observe all of the sanitation and safety measures to avoid spreading the coronavirus. But it's much easier to do that outdoors, and we will always do that, weather permitting, until further notice. So the meditation will be outdoors on Wednesday. I'm excited to share with you a new series on biblical brides, understanding their stories and understanding your journey. First bride that we are going to learn about is the passionately pious princess. And of course, all metaphysical interpretations of the Bible are about your story. And this particular story helps us to understand when your feminine side runs amok, how to notice it, and what to do about it. This princess came from Phoenicia. So here's a map of Phoenicia, Israel, and Judah. For about 500 years after the civil war that divided the country, there were two Jewish states, Israel and Judah. And it's called the period of the divided kingdoms. And so just for fun, I uh, kind of fished around and figured out the size of the northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital was Samaria, compared to Florida. And it's about two-thirds the size of Florida in just square miles. And as you can see, Phoenicia was a coastal country, and it while Israel did have some coast there, you can see, the Israelites never were seafaring people. Wasn't their thing. So it was very important for them to have good relations with seafaring people so that they could have trade and so forth. And of course, the Phoenicians needed access to the trade routes through Israel. So uh, it was very important that they have good relations. And in those days, one of the ways you did that was the kings of one country would marry the princesses from the other country, and that's what was done here. So this princess was, uh, what shall I say, engaged or promised to a prince in Israel. Phoenicia was not a Hebrew country, so they had their own gods. The principal god was Baal, and here we have two depictions of him. These are original from the time. The one on the left shows Baal with horns. Originally, Baal was seen as a big bull, and then that over time became a human body with the head of a bull, and then that over time, as you can see, became a human being with the horns of a bull, but it's all Baal. And then finally, in the final form, Baal was depicted as a king with a big tall crown. They also worshipped Asherah. She was the goddess consort of Baal. She was the goddess of fertility, and there you can see on either side she is feeding, probably looks like goats. And of course, they built beautiful temples to their gods. They did not put statues of their gods in their temples, but they had big, beautiful temples. You can see the tiny little people there in the slide, representing to show you how big the temples were. One of the sort of gruesome aspects of the worship of Baal is that he required infant sacrifices. So, in addition to, uh, crops and cattle and sheep, they would also sacrifice babies. The babies were between 1 and 2 months old. So, for a period of time, some Bible scholars doubted that this was actually true. It says in the scriptures, in our scriptures, their sons and their daughters they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. That was just fake news, that it was just bad publicity created by the Hebrews to make the Phoenicians look bad. But since then, we have extra biblical sources uh, of actual accounts uh, that explain that the idol was created with arms outstretched, and they were at a slight angle, so that when the baby was placed in the hands of the idol, it would roll towards the body of the idol and then slip down into the fire that was lit in the lap of the idol to be burned alive. Now, if you needed to sacrifice a baby and you didn't have one on hand, you could buy one. It was permitted that you buy the baby that was going to be sacrificed to the god Baal, and the mother who got the money for the baby had to be present, and she could show no sorrow. She could not say anything or cry or do anything to show that this was a sad time for her. If she shed a tear or said or did anything that indicated sorrow, she didn't get the money. She forfeited the pay. She had to come and willingly participate in the sacrifice of her baby. So that's a little insight into they were tough people. The high priest of the religion was the king. The king was the high priest, and his daughter would have been a priestess, a royal Phoenician priestess who would have participated in ceremonies. These are two very accurate depictions. One of them is an accurate statue, the one on the right, and the one on the left is a beautiful outfit being worn by a royal Phoenician princess who died, and this was the uh, lid to her sarcophagus, which has been uh, colored since to show how beautiful it was. But the actual uh, relief is still existent in a museum. So if you haven't guessed it yet, the name of this princess is Jezebel. Now, I know that the popular version of Jezebel, uh, when you hear that name, you think that she's some kind of seductress or an adulteress or even a harlot. But in fact, she wasn't any of those things because she didn't need to be. She was a princess. She was betrothed to a king. She was going to be the queen of Israel, and she was raised to be a priestess in the service of one of the principal gods of her country. So she didn't need to use her feminine wiles. Interestingly, the archaeologists have found a seal that they believe was her seal because of I can't really point them out to you, but there are actually Hebrew words inscribed there, and we they believe the words represent her name. So that was Queen Jezebel's royal seal that she would have put on her documents, and we believe she was literate. Uh, it's important to understand that Phoenician women were not treated uh, like women in the Israelite country. They were equal and powerful, and they were not just basically chattel like they were in much of the ancient world. So there came a time for the royal wedding, and it so happens that a song which was composed for the wedding of Jezebel and Ahab, once he took the throne, he sent for her, and she came, and they had this big, beautiful, elaborate wedding at which specially composed music was presented. And I'll read to you part of Psalm 45, which is the marriage music for this wedding. Listen, daughter, and pay careful attention. Forget your people and your father's house. Let the king be enthralled by your beauty. Honor him, for he is your Lord. The city of Tyre will come with a gift. People of wealth will seek your favor. All glorious is the princess in her chamber. Her gown is interwoven with gold. Her embroidered garments, in her embroidered garments she is led to the king. Her virgin companions follow her, those brought to be with her. Led in with joy and gladness, they enter the palace of the king. Your sons will take the place of your fathers. You will make them princes throughout the land. She brought with her, it says the virgins were brought with her. Actually, she brought with her hundreds of prophets of Baal and prophets of Asherah. Asherah was known throughout the Middle East and actually was worshipped by the Hebrew people as well, really right up until the time of the Maccabees. So you've already seen, I already showed you a little picture of a relief of the goddess feeding those goats. But that sort of morphed over time into a tree. So you can see two rams feeding off of a tree there in the second part of this collection. And that's Asherah as a tree. And then at the bottom, we have a sort of a modern interpretation of that, of the face of the goddess carved into a tree. And on the extreme right, an Asherah pole. And these were erected in sacred groves, and people would go there to worship and offer sacrifices to the goddess Asherah. And Jezebel promoted the worship of Baal and Asherah all throughout Israel. She was a apparently very smart and savvy politician because she became the power behind the throne. Ahab was just wrapped around her little finger, and she uh, apparently could get him to do whatever she wanted, like building temples to Baal all throughout Israel and uh, persecuting the prophets of Yahweh. So she was out there killing the prophets of Yahweh. And the leader of the prophets of Yahweh was the greatest prophet Israel has ever known. And that was Elijah, by far the greatest prophet. No one else can possibly compare to him among all the prophets of Israel. He is the one who is supposed to come before the Messiah can appear. When Jesus was transfigured on the mountain, he was accompanied by Moses and Elijah. Elijah did not die. He was taken up to heaven. There is none like him. His name means, "My God is Yahweh." His most wanted list. And he was in hiding. He was basically running the Yahwistic faction in the country from underground. But a day came when he arranged, strange as it may seem, to have a meeting with King Ahab. And of course, when he got there for the meeting, Queen Jezebel was right there with him. And as a result of this meeting, they decided to have a contest to see whose God was true. Was Yahweh really God, or was Baal really the God that everyone should worship? It was decided that there would be two sacrifices prepared, and the prophets of Baal would seek to have Baal come and consume their sacrifice, and Elijah would do the same with his. So the prophets of Baal built their big altar. They put a big carcass of a steer on it, a bull, I should say, and they prayed out loud. They chanted his name. They danced around the altar. They had a kind of a hesitating step uh, dance while they chanted. They would cut themselves with knives, calling on Baal to come. And it got to the point where Elijah, standing off to the side, started to make fun of them and say, "Well, you should yell louder. Maybe Baal is sleeping. Maybe Baal is gone aside," which was the euphemism for going to the bathroom. So, maybe Baal is in the bathroom. You guys should yell louder. And they yelled and yelled all day, and no Baal, and the sacrifice was not accepted. So now it's Elijah's turn. And Elijah builds his altar and digs a, a trench around it, like a moat. And then he orders that the sacrifice and all the wood that was supposed to burn the sacrifice, and the altar all be doused with water. And then he ordered that more jars of water be brought and that it be doused again. And then he ordered that more jars of water be brought and that it be flooded with water until the trench was filled. And then he just turned, lifted his face to the heavens, and said a simple little prayer invoking Yahweh to come and bless and accept the sacrifice. And boom, fire appeared. It came down and consumed the sacrifice, of course, all the wood, the stones, and all of the water. It was all consumed. It all went up in a big giant conflagration of fire and steam. Well, of course, the people were just stunned, and they all bowed down and proclaimed Yahweh as the true God. So at this point, Elijah did something that, well, when I first heard the story, I just accepted it. It's like that was their time, that was the way they did things. But actually, there's really no excuse for what Elijah did next. He ordered the death of all 450 Baal prophets. He had them all taken captive. He had them taken down to the river and slaughtered. There were also 400 prophets of Asherah in attendance, but he didn't order them killed. And I don't know what the reason for that is, but he didn't. So word gets back to Ahab, King Ahab, what has happened. And he goes and tells his queen, Jezebel, what has happened. Jezebel sits down and writes a note and puts her seal on it. And the note is taken to Elijah. So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Well, Elijah's reaction to this was also surprising. He went into a complete tiz. He got out of Dodge. He went all the way down into Judah, all the way to Mount Horeb, and hid in a cave. After a time, he heard a voice say to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God then gave Elijah a series of tasks to complete, including how Jezebel's reign would be ended. After King Ahab died, his eldest son became king, but he died after a year, under mysterious circumstances, and his second son reigned for about 7 years. So for several years, after Elijah won the contest with Baal, Jezebel remained queen, and then she became queen mother, no doubt continuing to be the power behind the throne. Following the instruction God gave Elijah, one of Elijah's followers anointed Jehu, a commander in the royal army, to be the next king and to incite a rebellion. Jehu jump-started the rebellion by killing the king. He then proceeded to Samaria, the capital of the country, right up to the royal palace. Of course, Jezebel knew that her son had been killed and that the dynasty was at an end. And while she was waiting for Jehu to come to Samaria, knowing that she was not long for this world, she put on her best and most beautiful royal robes. She put on good makeup, her good uh, special occasion makeup. She had her hair fixed, and she stood in the window overlooking the palace courtyard, waiting for Jehu. When Jehu arrived, he saw her there, with her eunuchs standing beside her, her bodyguards, and he commanded the bodyguards to throw her out the window, and they did. There's a special term for that, which I only learned yesterday when I was researching this. Maybe I learned it on Friday. It's called the defenestration. Defenestration means throwing somebody out of a window. So if you throw somebody out of a window, that's defenestration, and that is what they did to her. In this particular painting, she is depicted as fighting right up to the last. Look, she's holding on to the headdress of one of the eunuchs, and he's strangling her. And another eunuch is pushing on her chest to push her over. She has one leg still in the window, hanging on for dear life, and one of the eunuchs is bracing himself against the window sill and pushing down on her with his foot. So she falls out of the window, and Jehu is down there, and he just leaves her there while he and his fellow um, rebels enter the royal palace and have a feast. And when the feast was over, Jehu says, "Well, she is a princess. We really should bury her." So he orders that be given a proper burial. But when they go out, they find that the dogs have eaten her body, all except for the hands and the feet. So now we turn to the metaphysical meaning of this amazing, wonderful story. In metaphysical interpretation, every story in the Bible is about your soul's journey. The female characters represent the feminine aspect of your being: creativity, intuition, emotions, and inspiration. The male characters represent the masculine aspect of your being: logic, decision making, commitment, and discipline. Metaphysically, Jezebel could be called the ruling negative emotions on the physical plane of consciousness. Just as she met a violent death, passion and appetites tend to burn themselves out. So, at this point, I'm going to share with you a metaphysical interpretation of this story by one of my teachers at Unity Village, a wonderful metaphysician named Ed Rabel. I've edited a lot, of course, but here's the gist of it. I think this is the heart of his lecture on Elijah and Jezebel. Elijah made a number of stunning demonstrations, of which this is only one. But something comes into the picture with all this outer doingness and provingness, which temporarily foils Elijah's track record of success. And dear ones, it's the same thing that comes into the picture of individual Unity students' track record of successful demonstration. For Elijah, the challenger's name was Jezebel. But for you and me, that same challenger is known by other names like rage, depression, or some similar form of negative emotionalism. Now, I know that some of you get a little tired of hearing talk about negative emotions, negative emotions, negative emotions, and I can understand that. But they are something that have to be dealt with. They have to be coped with. There's no other way of handling the damage they do than by learning what the nature of this thing is and what measures we can take to undo or prevent the damage. The ideal would be preventive measures. It would be so much better if we could avoid the aftermath of what negative emotions do to us. But most of us aren't up to that yet. At least I'm not. So I'm busy doing corrective cleaning up work afterwards. But we have to do what we're able to do. It's no sense saying, well, I don't like negative emotion. I don't like to hear about them or talk about them. Well, you probably wouldn't have liked Jezebel either if you'd lived back then. But there she was. And she was queen. And she was such a troublemaker. What she symbolizes, I'm afraid, is still with us today. Look at yourself. Look at what is going on in the world today. This is what the Bible character Jezebel means. She represents, really, our own worst enemy in a certain stage of our unfoldment, the thing which spoils so much of our life for us. Jezebel was queen in this part of the Bible narrative, and you know what that would mean. So we each must constantly ask ourselves, is this what she symbolizes as queen within me right now? And you'll be surprised how often the answer will be, I'm afraid she is. I'm afraid she's the queen right now. In the Bible narrative, you will find that Elijah makes two mistakes in regard to Jezebel. The first mistake he makes is before his big act, and the second mistake he makes is after his big act. In the first mistake, he underestimated her current influence over him. And a lot of us are making that same mistake. We underestimate the influence that our own negative emotions still have over us. And then the second mistake he made was afterwards, when he overestimated her power to carry out her threat. And the same mistake is being made by us. Do you see the two sides of this coin? Folks, we underestimate the influence this factor still has over us. And then after it asserts itself, we overestimate the damage it can do to us. He felt so helpless in the face of her threat, helpless and hopeless, because she had threatened him violently. Likewise, in our lives, we do something that brings a reaction from our negative emotionalism, and we're confronted with it. And often, we just succumb to it. We say, I've got to believe it. It's been said. It's a real threat. And both of these are really mistakes. But we're learning. After his victory over the priests of Baal, Jezebel's very angry threats took him by surprise. He really was impressed enough to believe that she could carry out her threats, and this led him directly into a depressed state. When this happens in our own lives, if it's not handled while we're going into it, then we're going to have to go through the cycle of unfoldment. It's called discouragement. Watch out for discouragement coming into your consciousness. You can nip it in the bud if you're quick enough, if you're willing enough. If you can't, if you haven't been alert enough, or if it's taken you by surprise and you've let it go on, then you may enter into it. But it's never too late. If we don't nip it in the bud, then we'll possibly go through this adventure that Elijah goes through. He was so discouraged that he even prayed, "It is enough, O Lord, take away my life, because I am not better than my father." Now keep in mind what was causing his discouragement. He had just had a great victory. So what caused his discouragement? The threats of Jezebel. Remember, Jezebel represents the bringing forth of negative emotions, which he fell for, which he believed in the power of. And the same thing happens to us. We see ourselves in these characters. Self-pity is very apparent here, and I suppose we've all gone through self-pity. We look back on a thing like this and we ask, why did Elijah allow himself to be so overwhelmed by these really empty threats of Jezebel? The people were on his side. God was on his side. But you see, it's only now that we know that her threats were empty. Now we look back and we see that it was all empty threats, her impotent words. But right there at that time, Elijah could not see this. So how about us today? Are we really so much better equipped to see through that which Jezebel represents? Remember, she symbolizes the unillumined mystery of human nature called the subconscious negative emotionalism. How much do you and I really know about that area of ourselves? Very little. It's still a vast mystery to most of us. What she stands for cannot really be explained or justified, but only dealt with properly. But Elijah, at this stage, did not deal with her properly. In fact, he did not deal with her at all. He believed her, and he feared her, and tried to escape her. And the blessing for us is that we can learn from his mistake. First, do not believe in the power of your own negative emotions. Our negative emotions don't have any real power in and of themselves. The only power they can have is the power of our own belief in them. Don't give them belief, and these emotions will see that they have no power to harm you or damage your life. Instead of this, try to give your attention to the meaning of the next part of the experience, which is Elijah's experience in the cave. This tells us that the greatest power man can ever make contact with is silence, inner silence. The quickest and the surest way to find God is to become still. The secret is inner stillness. We know, friends, that much outer activity and much noise making are sometimes necessary parts of our existence. We can't do without this because existence being what it is, and the role we play in it, and the role we play in existence, these requirements come to us. Much doingness and outer activity and noise making is a necessary part of the outer life. But outer life is the realm of problems. Inner life is the realm of right answers, and the presence of God's help is symbolized in this story as a still, small voice. God is always to be found in the silence of your private inner being. This is the specific claim being made in this particular text, the idea of the power of the silence. Remember that in the outer realm of appearances and events and circumstances and manifestations, problems will always be found. And that's the area of doing and contending. The answer and the solution to all possible and existing human problems is found within, where silence and stillness rule and reign supreme, because they are your source. So let's end with this beautiful affirmation, and I invite you to say it with me. In the silence, I listen to the still small voice, and all is well. Amen. So be it, and so it is. This is Nancy Willingham, wishing you a happy week, a peaceful week, a healthy, safe week, until we meet again.